Okay, so this video is going to demonstrate how to load the XACML 3.0 custom assertions into the Layer 7 API gateway. And then on top of that, I'm going to walk through an example using the sample policies that come with the custom assertion to show how it works in the field. So let's start with how we actually go about loading the assertions. First things first, I have a virtual setup where I have virtual machines running both the gateway and a Windows environment. I use the Windows environment primarily because the Policy Manager tool seems to run best on Windows, and it always has. It does run well on Linux, but since my host platform is Mac OS 10, I sometimes run into glitches with the Policy Manager, mostly having to do with right-click operations. Sometimes control-click works, but a normal right-click seems to be a little dramatic for me on Mac OS 10. So I usually run inside of a virtual machine running Windows or Linux, and for this particular example, I'll be using Windows. So this screen you see here, this is actually the virtual machine running my gateway, and I just have the logs being tailed here so I can see what's going on if I need to. And in this window here, I have a Windows environment where I've already loaded up Policy Manager, and I'm going to connect to my API gateway. I have it configured so I use PKI, so I have a certificate already loaded for my particular account that's the administrator for the gateway. Most folks just use username and password for simple demo environments. I do this so much, I just did PKI using my own self-signed certs, blessed them in the gateway. I've already configured everything for that. So don't be surprised or put off by this. It's just a simple way for me to kind of log in and out of my environments quickly. This is the IP address of my gateway on my little virtual network, so I'll connect to it. I don't have the host name set up, so I'm using the IP address. It's complaining that the certificate has the real host name. No problem, I click OK. And dramatic pause, we're in. Okay, so now let's load the actual custom assertions. There are two custom assertions. One is for the policy enforcement point, which you can think of as sort of like the perimeter defense for incoming requests for protected resource. And the second one is the policy decision point. This is the actual component that implements all the logic that applies whatever rules you dream up to control access to a given protected resource. In practice, what happens is the policy enforcement point service will call out, typically just doing an HP request, to the policy decision point and pass it a request that describes what's going on, who's making the request, what the request is for, what protected resource the request is for, and any other attributes or information that I can pass along that might help in rendering that decision. The decision point is going to take all that and run through a set of XACML policies and rule sets to determine should it permit or deny, or perhaps come up with some inconclusive answer about whether or not access should be granted. So let's go to first step. Step one is going to be, let's load those assertions. So the way we do that is in the Policy Manager under Tasks, Extensions, and Add-ons, we're going to load what's called server module files. The API gateway has evolved a lot over the years I've worked with it, and one of the coolest features it's got is the ability to actually take and allow you to load new plugins, for lack of a better term, into the gateway that extend its functionality. So in this case, I've got two files here. One is the actual policy decision point assertion, the other is the policy enforcement point assertion. They are actually in the distribution inside of what's called a RAR, R-A-R archive. Those are basically compressed archives like a zip file or a gzip file. You can just run an unarchiving tool to decompress them and get to these files. But you'll see that the files we're operating with are called an sjar file and an SAAR file. Both of these serve pretty much the same purpose. The first one is a signed Java archive, and it contains all of the compiled bytecode for the PEP, or the policy enforcement point assertion, that we're going to be using. The reason it's important that it's signed is because that means that we can trust the code came from Broadcom or a vendor that is trusted enough to be allowed to sign their jars by Broadcom, and so it can be loaded into the gateway, and the gateway will trust it and start executing it immediately. Literally, there's no need to really worry about the gateway having any issues with these particular files because they're provided by the vendor that makes the gateway. Similarly, the SAAR file is a signed assertion archive. Now, sometimes there's a bit more to it than just the basic Java classes, and typically what you see with a signed assertion archive is that this is something that will actually have a bit more extensive modifications to the gateway, but it's still just simply Java code and whatever supporting files we need to essentially add new features to the gateway on the fly. So what I can do is I can load my policy enforcement point assertion first. It'll ask me for a name. I'll just call it my XACML 3.0 PEP. And then I'll also upload my policy decision point assertion. And I'll call this my XACML 3.0 PDP. And as you can see, it's literally just uploading it to the gateway, and the gateway is actually picking it up on the fly. Now here's where things get interesting. Depending upon your experiences with the gateway, the first thing you'll notice is that these features don't get enabled in the policy manager during the session you're currently in. You may have to disconnect from your gateway and then reconnect. Now you're seeing why I do the PKI, so I can get in and out quickly before you see some of the features pop up. Typically, what I find is that when I'm working with these archives, everything will pop up automatically. So you can see now I have the XACML policy decision point assertion is available and the create XACML 3.0 request assertion are available. If you run into a problem where this does not occur, like you load it up and it doesn't pop up, restart the gateway. Disconnect your policy manager just to make it clean. It doesn't really matter. But then restart your gateway, and you'll see the next time you fire policy manager and connect to it, it'll be there. Okay, so now I'm going to build out a policy enforcement point and a policy decision point using the API gateway. When I say I'm going to build these out, what that really means is I'm going to assign a policy to be executed whenever a request comes in for a given URL that matches the URL of my policy enforcement point, which is really just a URL where the gateway is fronting some back-end service potentially, and when a client hits the gateway will essentially defer to the policy decision point as to whether or not the client is authorized to access that back-end resource. So in essence, the request comes in, the policy enforcement point is going to create a XACML 3.0 request in memory, then it's going to take and issue that request as essentially an HTTP post request to the PDP's endpoint, which also resides on the gateway. And the PDP is going to render a decision saying permit or deny access to the backend resource. If it says permit, my policy enforcement point, in this particular scenario, is just going to echo the response from my policy decision point. But in reality, in a real situation, you'd probably just simply route the request on some backend service, allow it to do some processing, and come back with some meaningful results. This is really just an illustration to show the flow and how you would actually build out the basics of a policy enforcement point and a policy decision point. Okay, so here's how we do the policy enforcement point. I'm going to go to my XACML folder, which I just created. This is just something I use to keep my policies organized. And I'm going to create, or rather publish, a web API. Now, a web API, I can give any arbitrary name. In this case, I'll just call it a protected resource. And this would be the resource that we're going to actually have the gateway fronting. Now, the name could be whatever I dream up. It could be whatever service name I'm exposing. Usually, the target URL would be the URL of the backend service, but there's a lot that could potentially go on inside this policy. And to keep my life simple, I'm just going to skip over that. And I'm going to call this service protected resource and give it the URL of the gateway /XACML/ and I'll just call it protected. Okay? So this is where if anyone accesses the gateway at the gateway's IP address, say 9443 for the HPS port, /XACML/ protected, they'll get whatever this policy, this API gateway policy will return. So if I click finish, and let's say I do something simple, like return a simple response back. So here I'll change this to text plain and say, hello world. It's a classic example I use when teaching people how to use the gateway. If I go to my browser here and I surf to XACML protected, I'll see hello world. This is not what you really care about, obviously, at this point. But I'm going to take and add the ability to create the XACML request. So here I'm just going to use autocomplete. I'll say let's create a XACML 3.0 request, which is actually right here, so it doesn't have to do anything. I'll drag and drop this over. And now it allows me to visually build out the XACML 3.0 request. So let's talk about what this screen actually does. So first of all, you'll notice that it says SOAP encapsulation. Traditionally, XACML PDPs were SOAP-based, and you could only send the messages using SOAP messages, which of course required a SOAP envelope. And so we had to encapsulate in a SOAP 1.01 or SOAP 1.2 envelope. That's not the case for most of them now. It also reduces the size of the messages slightly and simplifies perhaps the processing of it by some of the more modern PDPs. In this case, I'll say none because, quite frankly, we don't need the overhead of SOAP, but it wouldn't hurt either way, at least not for this example. The message output, I can make the actual request that's being constructed go to either the default request variable, which in this case would actually be the request that's coming from the client. If I wanted to overwrite that request and make it and build my own request up that I'm going to send to the PDP, I could overwrite the default request. The response could also be used, but that's typically something I return back to the client. So instead, I'm going to put it inside of a variable that I'm going to just give an arbitrary name of XACML request. And that's the variable that's going to contain whatever I'm building out here. So what am I going to build? Well, I have to add some attributes to this request. I have to describe who's making the request, what they're requesting, and what actions they're trying to take on that request. And that's going to be described using attributes on the request. So if I right-click on the request and I say Add Attributes, in order of importance to me personally, I'll say, well, let's first of all think about the access subject. And that access subject, I'm going to say that I want to get the subject ID, and the subject ID's value is going to be in the format of an email address, which is called an RFC 822 name. And the value is going to be, and this is always the example I see floating around for XACML demos, is BS for Bart Simpson at med.example.com. So that would be the who is making the request, the subject. The next thing I need to do is I need to describe what they're accessing. So in this case, that's the resource. And so here, I'm going to add an attribute, and I'll say that the resource ID is the attribute I'm going to be describing. And I'm going to take and say that this is going to be a URL. And for the first time, I'll show you a dynamic variable. I can actually show you the URL that's being requested. The policy I'm using is so simplistic, it's not going to really care about it, but I just want to show you how I might access a variable from the gateway. In this case, there's a variable baked into the gateway called request, and inside that variable, it's a aggregate type. There's a field called URL that describes the URL that's being requested. So if I put $ open curly brace request.url close curly brace, when I build up this XACML request, it will actually embed the value of the actual URL inside this particular attribute value that's being placed inside the request. So that's a really powerful tool. And again, if I wanted to do authentication prior to doing this, I could have authenticated the user, grab their username or their email address or what have you. I don't have access to an LDAP server for this particular demo, so I didn't have like a huge corpus of users to work with email addresses and so on. So I just hard-coded BS at med.example.com. But if I were really going to authenticate users, I would do something similar to this, where I would capture that user's identity in a variable and store it inside that attribute value for my subject. So instead of hard-coding it like I did here, I'd be using a variable like I'm doing for the actual URL that's being used to describe the resource they're trying to access. And finally, I need to describe what they're trying to do. So this is where things get interesting. So in this case, I want to describe the action. And the type of action will be described with an action ID. And this is something that's typically described as a string, at least in most of the scenarios I've worked in. And the string is usually arbitrarily decided. So for example, if you were accessing a service that's wrapping a data source, you might have classic CRUD operations like, create, update, delete type operations. And so you would describe it using those terms. If I'm doing a service that's based on HTTP and I want to use all the HTTP methods, I'd have get, post, put, delete options, and so on. In this case, I'll just say I'm going to use a generic name for what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to read some data. And that's actually a common scenario that we see in the examples being used on most of these XACML demos. So, at this point, just to kind of refresh, the action that's being taken it has a given ID of read. So they're trying to read from this URL on behalf of the user bs@medexample.com. Okay, so that's my XACML 3.0 request. It's being stored in a variable called XACML request. And now I need to issue that to a PDP. Now I have not created the PDP yet. So the way I'm going to access it ultimately will be by routing to it. And I'm going to use, the IP address of my gateway, which you've seen earlier. And my PDP, which I've not created yet, is going to be available at /XACML/PDP on my gateway. Again, the gateway has an HTTPS port open on port 9443, where only the server presents its cert. The client doesn't have to identify itself in any way, so I'm going to use that for simplicity's sake. And what's going to happen is I'm going to route to that and get a response back. And if they say everything's good, they'll send me back a message saying permit. And you'll notice that I also disabled the original hello world message so that what comes back will be the raw message from the decision point. That's not what I would do in a real scenario. In a real scenario, I would then route to some back-end service, get their response, and then essentially bless everything that's coming through. But in this case, it's just going to basically echo whatever the decision is that's rendered. One thing I want to stress that I actually made a mistake on when I was first recording this is I forgot to set the request that's being sent by my policy enforcement point to be the XACML request message I constructed. So if you were to look at this video and look at the times that I'm editing it, you'll see that I had to bounce around and go, wait a second, why didn't that work? So just in advance, I'm going to edit this so that you see this. When I set up this route via HTTPS, I'm actually going to specify that the request that's being sent to the policy decision point is the XACML request. So now I'm ready to create my policy decision point. So let's do that by doing the same exact steps we did with our policy enforcement point. We'll publish a web API. I'll call this my XACML PDP. The URL to access it should be the URL that I essentially decided on myself for where my PDP would live when I created my policy enforcement point, which is just the host and port of the gateway /XACML/PDP. So down here I just put XACML/PDP for the URL. I click finish. And before I go too deep, and this is an important point, I should probably load in some XACML policies first so I have something to reference. So I'll go to tasks, extensions and add-ons, XACML documents, and I'm going to read in a XACML file. In this case, it's one of the files that's provided called XACML3 test policy 1. And if you look at this policy, what it will say is, essentially, the main rule says it permits access if the name of the user in their email address matches, or essentially has a substring somewhere in there called med.example.com. And it's got to be present inside the access subject ID. Those must be present. So I have this, I can click validate, life is good. You may run into glitches with the policy manager if you put in a poorly designed policy, like if it has glitches in it. Like a common one for me is on the Mac, quotation marks can sometimes, they'll have open and close quotes, which are different than just normal quotation marks, because the Macintosh always has to be a little bit different. So one of the things I've run into is when it goes to evaluate it, the characters are incorrect and it just completely hates the XML that's generated. So you'll see error messages pop up for things like that that can be hard to debug. My recommendation is if you have a good authoring tool, use that. Just make sure that the policies are valid according to the policy manager. If you get weird errors in the policy manager and it seems like there's something wrong with the product itself, definitely just reach out to us, contact support. They can look into it. But More often than not, it has to do with something with the formatting of the document that may be altered by either the nature of the character set or cutting and paste operations between different platforms. Again, I have a weird environment where I'm on a host platform that's Mac based. I'm using I'm using VMware to actually host a Windows environment that I'm using for my policy manager, and so there can be glitches here and there. But for the most part, this is cake. So like you see, it's a very simple policy, and we can go from there. So now, the gateway policy for this policy decision point winds up being just this one assertion. I'm going to use the XACML policy decision point to say, take the incoming request, which in this case was the request being issued by my policy enforcement point, which is also called protected resource here. I'm going to say it's the XACML 3.0 policy decision point. Policies are located internally, though I could have them exposed on external sites, for example, off of a URL. That's probably a better way to do it in the grand scheme of things, but for this particular example, it's totally fine. The policy that I just imported, the XACML policy I just imported, it shows up here. And so it will go through and apply all of the policies that are listed in this particular policy set. And now I can look and see if I want to support policy information points, which allow me to do attribute, basically essentially gather attributes from external services. What's interesting here is when I go and do attribute lookups, all it does is kick off an API gateway policy. Again, that's not a XACML policy, it's a gateway policy. So it's exactly what I'm using for constructing my policy enforcement point and my policy decision point. So it's basically just running those assertions that are inside one of those policies to perhaps go to some external service or hit a database or SFTP a file over and then use that as the basis for gathering attributes about the subject, the environment, or whatever else might be relevant to rendering an authorization decision. In this case, we don't have to do any of that, but if you're interested in doing that, I have some examples I can construct to show you how that would work. It's not very difficult. The assertion settings, I can decide that if this fails, the entire PDP should fail and send back like an HTTP 500 error message. In this case, I want whatever I do here to go back to the client, and the client in this case, like I said, is the policy enforcement point. So we'll just let that go through. So I'll click OK, and that is my policy decision point. It's going to be literally one assertion that simply just says delegate all of the logic about how to process this to the XACML engine that we've embedded inside the gateway. This brings me a really interesting point I'd like to make, which is that you could implement the same rules we have in the XACML policy in using the assertions that are in the gateway. I find that it's really just a question of if you don't want to be locked into a particular vendor and you want to embrace XACML 3.0 fully, then yeah, by all means, you should definitely implement your rules for governing authorization decisions in XACML 3.0. In practice, what I find is that a lot of folks wind up using the native policy language of the gateway because it's easier to work with that visually and it's easier to verify what's going on in the debugger and using the tools that are baked into the product. But your mileage will vary, and honestly, there's really no wrong way to go about doing this. So I'm going to save and activate this policy, and now I'm going to go ahead and kick this off, and I'll show you exactly how it works. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to my window, my browser window, where I originally opened up my protected resource. I'll stretch my window out so you can see the URL again. So originally it said hello world. Now it should take and route to the policy decision point, get the response, and send me something back. So if I say reload, you'll see it comes back with a response from the policy decision point, which says that the response was a permit decision and the status is okay. Now, we can tweak things. In fact, one of the things I can do is if I go back in here and I modify my XACML request properties and I change the attributes here. For example, if I change this to foo@bar.com, for example, so changing my user's identity. If I save and activate that, and one thing I have to be careful about is that sometimes we'll cache the results in the browser, but if I run this, you'll see it says the decision is not applicable. That's not permit. So that implies that the decision could not be rendered based on the policy set. So it didn't give me a deny, but it did not give me permit. So what you're seeing is that the XACML policy is actually evaluated based on the parameters coming in, the attributes coming in this case, the attribute of the subject's identity. So I just wanted to show you like a quick example of how that works, and hopefully it, open things up. So if you have any other questions, hopefully I can help out. And yeah, hopefully this is enough to help you get started with the XACML 3.0 custom assertion on the API gateway.